My question to the panel is, given the Gaza Health Authority is now reporting 10,000 people have been killed in a month in Gaza, and the West broad military and diplomatic support for that mission, does that not seriously undermine the claim that they uphold international law and the rules-based system? Because I believe that, we're looked at, around the world is, we're treated as a laughingstock, when we're supporting what's happened in Gaza. Does it not seriously undermine our claim that America, Britain, EU support international law, given our unambiguous support for what's happened in Gaza? That's my question to the panel.
Well, we should point out the Gazan Health Ministry is, of course, controlled by Hamas, and sometimes its figures are questioned. Lucy Powell.
Well, this is obviously a very pertinent, good question. And I think that we all want to see this conflict ending. We want to see the needless loss of life that we all see on our screens every evening ending. We want to see the hostages that are still being held by Hamas to be freed. And we, I think, all agree and would all recognise that in the end, this will only be settled by a peaceful political solution, which the Labour Party, we want to work to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside an independent and free Palestine. And as the caller, as David said, in the meantime, that anything that is happening there in the conflict needs to adhere to international law. And international law says that any action, retaliation or action otherwise in order to protect borders and get hostages returned needs to be targeted. It needs to protect civilian loss.
Is it being targeted in your view?
Well, look, I'll just set out what it needs to be, which is that it needs to be targeted. It needs to protect civilian life where possible. It can't be indiscriminate targeting of civilians, absolutely not. And under international law, water, food and fuel can't be withheld. And the Israeli government, and I think the international community is bearing down on that and is making that very clear to the Israeli government, Britain included. And Israel will have to account for that under international law. It's not for us to sit here in a TV studio and sort of say what is or isn't happening on the ground. Those facts will become clear and will emerge, and there are proper international processes by which those issues are judged. But that is what the international... we've got, the Americans are over there at the moment. British, whether that's opposition or government leaders have been out in the region as well to make clear that we do expect, as a democratically elected government that is an ally, an international ally, we do expect them to adhere to those rules of international law.
Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have both said that. Doesn't that indicate that there's a suspicion even on their part that is not what is happening? Well,
they absolutely, and I think they need to, they want to sort of guard against that, because it is an emotional, it has been, obviously the attacks on October the 7th were almost unprecedented in terms of what happened to Israelis, ordinary Israelis going about their business with so many dead and so many taken hostages on Israeli soil, and so the response could be emotional and could not adhere to those rules and those international guardrails. And I think that's why it's been made very clear to the Israeli government that it needs to do that. Now, I think we can all see things on the TV screen and say, well, look, it's awful, and that's why we want to see the conflict ending as soon as possible.
How much pressure are you coming under as a shadow cabinet minister, Labour MP, from people within your own local party as well as constituents in Manchester? Wes Streeting, I think there was a demonstration in his constituency against him at his constituency office, saying that he should stand down because of his support for Israel. Are you getting any of that?
Well, look, I mean, let's just be clear. I mean, I'm not. We support a two-state solution here, and that is the objective, and we support a safe and independent and free Palestine alongside a secure Israel. But yeah, I mean, I had a protest outside my office a couple of weeks ago. I've had lots of emails from people, and I totally understand the concerns of the hundreds of people who've been in touch with me in Manchester about this issue. And look, Manchester, we're a very diverse city. We've got a very long-standing and large and traditional sort of Jewish community in Manchester, and we also have a large Muslim community and many other communities in Manchester who are concerned about this. And I think, this conflict has touched people in a way that foreign policy issues and these kind of issues haven't touched people for a very long time, because it's in their living rooms, and lots of people are directly affected by it.
And just finally, you are 100% content with Keir Starmer's position on this no ceasefire?
Well, look, I think what we are saying are
Could have been a yes or a no answer.
Well, no, I think a humanitarian pause, which is what Keir has been calling for, in those principal sort of starting points, that we want the conflict to end, that we want any action to be within international law, and that ultimately we want a peaceful political two-state solution, that a humanitarian pause, what that Keir has I think rightly recognised, is where the international community is at. That's the most likely, the most practical way of getting aid in and getting the hostages freed and getting a pause on this situation.
James Bethell.
I think every night I've slept badly, worried about the death and destruction that's happening on the ground. There's a acute moral dilemma here, because Hamas is determined to wipe out the state of Israel and, by implication, a lot of the Jewish people who live in Israel. But they are buried in tunnels underneath hospitals and schools and refugee camps, and it's the most awful process of winkling them out. And I thought the pictures today that seemed to show tunnels and access points into Hamas tunnels close to those public utilities were really disturbing, because they spell a story of how much more tough it's going to be. I think that Keir Starmer has done a good job in terms of his own party management. I think he's making up for some years where anti-Semitism has crept into British society quite a lot, and that's a real shame. And I had dinner at the weekend with Jewish friends of mine. I was quite shocked by how worried they were about the day-to-day anti-Semitism, the graffiti, the attacks in the street, the comments, the security guards that they're having to live with. And I think that kind of friction in our society is hugely regretful, and we're going to see more of it this weekend.
What about what David says, though, about the 10,000 people that the Gaza Health Ministry claim have been killed in the last month? He says, doesn't this undermine the West claim that it's upholding international law during this war?
Well, as Lucy said, I'm not an arbiter of international law. I do have a sense of my own personal morality, and the idea of thousands and thousands of innocent civilians dying in this brutal conflict is very, very disturbing. And I think we should be doing everything we can to press Israel to create the kinds of gaps that civilians can use to find food, water and shelter. But Israel must defend itself. And I don't know how to reconcile that moral conflict between the absolute need and certainty that Israel must protect itself and the protection of the Palestinians who live in Gaza. And unpicking that is going to be really difficult.
Jürgen Maier.
Look, it is a dreadful situation that we're seeing on the ground. However, I do reflect back to the day this started and the images we saw on that day of 1,700 people being slaughtered in the most horrible way. So at that point, it was obvious that Israel was going to react in a huge way. I guess it was also obvious that it was probably going to be overproportionate. And I think at this moment in time, what we're seeing is that there are just too many innocent bystanders being killed here. So I think it is right that the world is increasingly calling for, and to be honest with you, I think whether it's a ceasefire or a pause, I think is almost semantics, because a ceasefire would probably only end up being a pause anyway, because tensions are so high. But I think given where we are now, and given the point that David makes, I mean, even if it's half of 10,000, let's say the figures are distorted, and it's 5,000, it's horrific. And therefore, I think right now, to be increasingly calling for a pause, to talk about conversations and see how we can find a way of finding these terrorists without so much innocent human damage, which is what we're seeing right now.
Let's go to our second Lucy on the panel, Lucy Fisher.
Well, look, I think I slightly disagree with the caller's characterisation of the way the West has been approaching this, because I don't think it's been static. I think we have seen an evolution as this has gone on, as we've seen the bombardment of Gaza, very much foursquare behind Israel's right to defend itself, but in terms of the emphasis and tone, also stressing the need to protect civilian lives, to try and adopt a surgical approach to rooting out Hamas. I've also been struck by my colleague at the FT, Gideon Rachman, who has described what the West is doing as hug-em-close diplomacy, which I also think has been important early on after the atrocity of October the 7th, to show Israel that the US, UK, Europe was behind them, in solidarity with them, while they were traumatised, frightened, facing this existential threat, still in grief and shock. And it's only when you try and reassure Israel that they have the support of their allies that you can influence them to try and show some restraint. So I think that this has been strategic, the approach that the West has been taken. It has changed into... Well, look, I think, we've seen Antony Blinken flying in and out. I think the West has been instrumental in also negotiating with Egypt and Israel to get the Rafah border open, get some aid in, get some dual nationals out. Of course, it is appalling. It goes without saying, the death of civilians and the scale of suffering that we're all seeing on our TVs night after night. But I do believe it is having some influence, yeah.
Because I think you could say that in the first 2 weeks, where there wasn't the ground invasion that I think everyone expected to happen within a few days. And even now, most of the deaths are being caused by missile strikes from the air. It's not, there hasn't been this large-scale invasion that I think everyone expected from the beginning. But who knows what will happen over the next couple of weeks.